So with no more from me, I think we'll ask Tamara, I think, to speak next, if that's okay.
Hi, sure. I'm sorry if I'm speaking a little quietly. I'm still hoping that the rest of my household doesn't wake up quite yet. And my apologies for missing the first session that I was supposed to speak at. I realized that it was 3:30 in the morning, my time. And with a less than 2-year-old, it was just a little bit too hard to pull off. So my apologies again, but I'm really happy to be here. And so, and maybe another sort of caveat, my video talk was doing double duty. And so that came from a presentation that I also gave at the International Communication Association meeting. And so that was why it was focused on a particular case study and centered around the effects of COVID specifically. But just to contextualize my work, I've been studying digital death practices since 2007 formally, starting with my master's thesis, going on to my dissertation, which I defended in 2016, and culminating, I guess, in my monograph, which is currently under review. So hopefully the reader reports will be kind. And so while I don't focus on privacy per se, I do interface a lot with the legal, but within the sense of the estate. So I spend a lot of time looking at the relationship between digital remains and other forms of belongings of the dead, and the ways that memory, but also possessions and objects are transferred from one generation to the next. So a lot of my work is informed by gender studies and anthropology, theories of kinship and inheritance. And I have sort of interviewed people who are within the context of the law, including Megan Yip, who unfortunately could not be with us here today. And so I am familiar with a lot of those arguments. I also have written sort of anecdotally about digital remains and the data of the dead in relation to things like affect and the social, including labor practices, which tends to come up in pretty much all of my work. So, maybe you've seen little things I've written in Slate on, say, Herman Cain tweeting from beyond the grave, or the implications, especially on a sort of affective, family level of what it means when people's lectures can be used after they die, when they're faculty members at, say, a university like Concordia. And also phenomena like QR codes for the dead, and thinking about how the data of the dead and is intermixed with care for physical remains. So thinking about sort of the intersection of different kinds of death care. And I'll stop there for now, because I'm sure that, I'm not really totally sure what else has been covered in the former section. So I'll just give it a rest for now and yield my time to other people.
Actually, Tamara, before you, I'm also conscious that you may have a limited window of time before, as you say, the rest of your household wakes up. So it might be a good time, actually, to ask you a couple of questions about that, because I was really interested in your presentation. And having actually and I wish I'd talked to you for this podcast. I talked to Al Gadari and some other people you might know, but around sort of dead labor and the labor of dead professors, and and how sort of kind of dead labor, the labor of the dead and the labor of the living sort of sit alongside. So I'm interested in digital remains as sort of how they are, how they're remaining, sticking around, can be exploited, can be in some ways used as a disadvantage, or sort of like frame or kind of shape the activities of the living. And that's an unusually it's a different active kind of way, different to how we usually think about the sort of digital remains as these kind of like passive things that just sit there, and thinking about how they might be used and exploited. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of my work thinks about inequality and hierarchies and power, and how things like race, gender, and sexuality inform how the data of the dead are treated and people's sort of emotional responses to that. So thinking about, sort of especially Black artists and musicians whose persons are revivified somehow through digital remains and continue to perform for the living, and sort of clearly the role of state law in this, but also longer histories of oppression and sort of structural inequalities. And another thing is sort of the disconnect in terms of how people imagine that their legacy will look, and the fantasies around digital immortality, particularly within secular transhumanist circles, but also within religious transhumanism, just to bring in the sort of spiritual side. And so I've spent a little bit of time with Mormon transhumanists who are really putting together conceptions of theology and cosmology with their conception of an afterlife. And they mean that in a religious sense, as well as in a sort of technological, traditional post-human, like transhumanist sense. And so thinking about then on the other side, for the people who are then caring for digital remains over the long term, what the labor repercussions are from their perspective. And so what are sort of the material components of maintaining the dead over the long term. So for instance, interviewing people who are attempting to manage their dead father's smart home, and figure out how all of the different light fixtures work and how to sort of keep it from falling apart altogether. And so what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of, sort of tinkering practices do you actually need to have in your repertoire in order to maintain digital remains for the long term?
Thanks very much for that. That was really useful, and I put it in the chat. But I kind of commend Julia Crete's data mining the deceased to everyone with respect to what you're talking about, with respect to Mormon transhumanism, and how that also kind of links into something that we don't have space to talk about here, which has to do with the whole sort of genealogy kind of industry and how that interfaces with it. Because we're talking a lot about sort of social media, we're talking about emails, we're talking about all those sorts of things. But I think that sometimes what we leave out in our thinking is stuff to do with genealogical kind of privacy and the data of the deceased in that context as well. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tamara. I'm sure that we'll have you in again soon. Maggie, did you have any thoughts on or a question for Tamara before we move on to the next?
No, I'd just like to follow up maybe later on the Mormon stuff that that I've been discussing with people, and maybe have a private conversation with you about some of that. It would be great.
Perfect.